The addict's brain. The anatomy of compulsion and need. An addict's brain is said to be different from a healthy brain. Fortunately, the science of the human brain is constantly evolving. Hopefully this will make it easier to help those addicts who really need it. People often say that there are between 3 and 5 different forces, or personalities, present in the addict's brain. There is someone who has no willpower and only thinks about feeling good, which generates or perpetuates the addiction. Another expects the damage that the addiction will create in the short and long term: anxiety, depression, withdrawal symptoms. Their other personalities are loneliness and fear. However, the presence of all these voices is not at all related to the classic profile of a person with multiple personalities. That's because if there is one thing we should know about addiction, it's that it completely fragments the idea of our identity, thoughts and willpower. Addiction is like a thief patiently waiting in a corner to invade our property and disrupt every area of our brain, mind, and dignity. I was convinced that for some mysterious reason I was harmless and would not become addicted. But addiction doesn't negotiate with you, and little by little it dissipates inside me like fog. Eric Clapton. Techniques that lead to healing. Sometimes even the best cognitive behavioral therapy techniques can't make the thief turn around and give up. Thus, another strategy for rewiring an addict's brain is to use a medical and pharmacological approach. But we should not get confused. The drugs used to relieve withdrawal symptoms and many associated side effects can become addictive in themselves. Furthermore, the neural connections that create addiction, as well as certain thoughts and behaviors, do not always respond to initial treatments. The road to recovery can be a long and expensive process that requires a multidimensional approach. This means that many people with chemical or behavioral addictions find themselves in true dead ends. Each person needs to find a strategy that works for them and their needs and characteristics. The addict's brain, the craving for the emotional vacuum. When we talk about addiction, it is common that the first thing that comes to mind is someone who uses opiates, hallucinogens or designer drugs such as amphetamines. We forget that addiction has many faces and forms of behavior. There are shopaholics and people who cannot separate themselves from their mobile phones. There are people who are addicted to sex, sports, games and certain foods. An addict is not just an alcoholic or a person who uses hard drugs. Ultimately, addiction is characterized by a physical dependence on a substance or a certain behavior. However, the end result is always the same: an inability to function normally in society. Moreover, addicts also tend to suffer a lot. What do all addiction processes have in common? All forms of addiction have one thing in common. At the 4th International Conference on Behavioral Addictions, held in Budapest last year and published by the Journal of Behavioral Addictions, experts concluded that the common denominator of all cases of addiction is compulsion. Naomi Feinerberg is a psychiatrist and neuropharmacology specialist at the NHS Foundation Trust, HPFT, working in Hertfordshire, England. She explained that people with addiction have obsessive-compulsive disorders, as well as low cognitive flexibility and limited or non-existent personal goals. The addict's brain always shows certain changes in the ventral regions of the prefrontal cortex, an area related to emotional meaning and ability to control. Thus, she concludes something that many neurologists and addiction specialists agree on: the people who are addicted to a substance or a behavior replace their addiction with an emotional need. But in their efforts to satisfy this gap, they end up in compulsive behavior. These behavior patterns are impossible for the brain to control. The neurological mechanism behind addiction. the addict's brain works differently. Its only goal, its greatest priority and need is to find the well-being that comes from the use of said substance or said behavior. This behavior or substance generates an immediate and limited sense of pleasure. Little by little, this external stimulus replaces the natural reward mechanisms that the body itself possesses, and the brain needs more and more to be stimulated. Dopamine is key to any addiction process. What is the reason? Dopamine generates a desire for the drug. This means that the rest of the brain's regions are directed towards the same need. For example, the corpus striatum is the first to start. It recruits structures such as the mesonephylon and the orbitofrontal cortex. The whole brain understands that this substance or behavior is a priority and begins to focus on that one goal. In general, all drugs produce severe changes in the activity of the mesocortical limbic dopamine-generating system. Thus, if consumption becomes chronic, neuroaddictive and neuroplastic changes will take place until it reaches a point where the structure of the system is completely altered. The prefrontal cortex is one of the most affected regions of the brain. Drastic changes are happening in this region. In the addict's brain, emotions, and how they are regulated, are altered. The same happens for the cognitive processes. It becomes difficult for the addict to focus attention, to reason, to control their own behavior, to make decisions. There is another aspect that we must also talk about. When we talk about alcohol and drug addiction, the changes that take place in the brain are enormous. They can even be very destructive. Changes produced in the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala and the striatum are in many cases irreversible. Is addiction a chronic disease? As we have pointed out, the addict's brain can sometimes show chronic changes. Intoxication caused by certain substances inhibits short-term memory and the ability to store new information. Similarly, alcohol, for example, has a severe impact on the cerebellum, which can affect aspects such as motor coordination. Thus, experts from the National Institute on Drug Abuse made it clear that addiction is basically a recurrent and chronic brain disease. However, there are already many neurologists who question this claim. The key to contradicting such a claim is a concept we all know and have heard of on more than one occasion: cerebral neuroplasticity. The brain is not like the heart, stomach or pancreas. The brain has an unusual ability. It is made to change, produce new neural connections, learn, create new tissues, and nerve cells. Therefore, if our brain had not changed constantly throughout our lives, we would be in a coma. We all develop, change and learn new skills. The consequences. What does all this mean and what does it have to do with the brain of an addict? Basically, it means there is hope. It is like many patients with brain damage who can improve certain aspects of their lives through rehabilitation. The same can happen in people suffering from addiction. This largely involves creating new synapse patterns based on new behavior and new thoughts. This is a door to change that many clinics and rehabilitation centers are introducing today with good results. Science and knowledge about the human brain is constantly evolving. Hopefully this will make it easier to help those addicts who really need it.